everyone, and welcome to today's ASEE virtual panel, Anti-Racism in Engineering Education, From Dialogue to Action. My name is Beverly Watford, and I'll be acting as producer for today's panel. Before we begin, I'd like to go over just a couple of housekeeping items. We are happy to offer live captioning for this event, which you can see in the bottom left section of your screen below the speaker videos. If you have questions for our panelists, you may submit them at any time in the Q&A pod, which you will see in the top right section of your screen. I'd ask that if you wouldn't mind, please complete our quick poll below the Q&A pod to let us know just a little bit more about you. There are a lot of people on this webinar. Our panelists will be discussing and sharing resources today. If you have any resources you would like to share or recommend, you can do so in our resources pod, which we will pull up below the Q&A pod in just a minute. We will also be sending the recording from this virtual panel along with a collected list of resources. You will receive these items via email within 2 business days. I'd like to now call upon our panel members to introduce themselves. I'll start with myself. As I said, my name is Bev Watford. I work at Virginia Tech. For the next 15 days, I am the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. I will be stepping down from that job to become the Associate Dean for Equity and Engagement. I am a Professor of Engineering Education, and I am a past president of ASEE. Chris, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Christopher Carr, and I am the Chief Diversity Officer at the Volcano School of Engineering at George Mason University.
Would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I'm James Moore. I am the Vice Provost for Diversity, Inclusion, and Chief Diversity Officer at Ohio State University.
Thank you, James. Yvette, your turn.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yvette E. Pearson. I'm Associate Dean for Accreditation, Assessment, and Strategic Initiatives in the George R. Brown School of Engineering at Rice University. I also chair the American Society of Civil Engineers Advisory Council on Diversity and Inclusion called Mosaic. I host a podcast called Engineering Change that focuses on equity in engineering education. And I will be joining the Engineering Accreditation Commission of ABET as a commissioner next month.
Congratulations on that, Yvette. That's great. Margaret.
Hi, everybody. My name is Margaret Schultz. I am the Administrator for Social Emotional Learning and Educational Equity in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and formerly a high school math teacher and also assistant principal. So I'm just thankful to be here with all of these esteemed colleagues.
And we are so glad you're here as well. So now, let me start by thanking ASEE for hosting a panel on this incredibly important topic. I don't think it's a stretch to say that besides COVID-19, racism is the second most talked about topic these days. I would be remiss in not recognizing George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and all others who have been the victims of the racism that pervades our communities. Institutions of higher learning are far from immune to the systemic racism that exists. It is my hope that this panel will explore not just what the problems are, but what the potential solutions that we as educators can support and employ to make real changes. I'll mention something else. If you follow Twitter, take a look at hashtag #BlackInTheIvory, and you will read comments from faculty across all disciplines explaining what the daily life of Black faculty is like. The subtle and the not so subtle comments and actions of their colleagues. Just take a look and take it in. So I'm going to start this panel. I've got a question for you. What is your institution doing right now in response to recent events in the United States that have spotlighted the breadth, depth, and sometimes fatal consequences of institutional and individual racism on the Black community? And I'll start with Yvette.
Thank you, Bev, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. One thing, like all other institutions, ours was out front with making a statement, really denouncing what we are seeing going on in our communities and acknowledging how that also carries over into academic and workplace environments. One very promising thing that I think is a good step in the right direction is that our university is providing funding to support nonpartisan engagement and community-based efforts here in the Houston area to be able to have people actively engage in anti-racism initiatives. And so I think that's a huge step because it's going beyond that conversation and that statement to say we're going to put financial resources to enable our students and whoever else wants to be involved in engaging in these activities actively in the community. So that's one example.
Excellent. James, can you comment?
Thank you, Matt, for having this opportunity to be here, certainly to be a part of this important conversation. As you all know, that is a lot of people hurting, and the hurting has been long, ongoing. And so at the university, because I'm the chief diversity officer at the university, as you can imagine, I'm running the marathon at a sprinter's pace. And so working with senior leadership, first we had to first get our statements together. There are a lot of statements, and I get a lot of responses. People push back that the statements fall flat. They basically say nothing. And so first and foremost, we had to provide some counseling guidance about statements, which is very important. First, we have to call it what it is. It was racism. It was barbaric. It was terrorism. You got to call it, and you can't use euphemisms to describe what we saw in Minneapolis and what we've seen consistently around the country, as well as we have to convey empathy for the victims and the repetitiveness of people, Black families enduring this constant attack by police officers and beyond. And three, you have to share that some action steps. You got to say, what are you doing? And then four is the last thing is you have to say, what have you been doing and what are the outcomes of those things? Well, at OSU, what we did, we respond pretty boldly, like we responded for the COVID-19. We put $1 million in seed grants, and we wanted to align the work with our academic mission. And we believe that the institution is poised to take on this problem like they take on any other problem. Like we took on opiates and we raised money to do that. And so we put $1 million in seed grants to bring some of the best minds together so we can not only just study things to study it, but we can begin to think about solutions. We also, we put a task force together, which I'm the chair of this task force that focus on racism and racial disparities. And basically, this task force is going to present a set of actions and steps that can make us a more ideal university for everybody who works at the place. And so we're going to be looking at processes, programs, policies, and positions. As you all know, some of the challenges that we have is not just the written policies, it's the unwritten kinds of things. In regards to the police, which many major cities, small cities, large cities are enduring in terms of the interactions with police departments. Our president reached out to the mayor and city council, and he is putting forth the idea of citizen review board, which students can be a part of this review board for independent review of cases that we may have with police officers. And last but not least, Columbus is one of those early cities. We're pretty flawed, but we are very committed to trying to address some of our many flaws. The city of Columbus declared racism as a public health issue. The county declared it and put out a resolution that racism is a public health issue, as well as city council. And we align our Wexner Medical Center with that to mobilize and concentrate research on how we can address infant mortality, things that we see within the Black community that is that just stands out beyond other racial groups. That's just a small few things that we've done, and we wanted to respond immediately, but there are some forthcoming other things that we plan to do.
Excellent, James. It's amazing what the political climate, the having Columbus City actually weigh in on these issues is really, really important, and that's a great first step. Margaret, what are your thoughts on what we can do?
I also am thankful just to be able to be a part of the conversation. I work in a pre-K through 12 educational setting, and so I think we were saying we put out a statement right away, and then really started thinking about like what is action, right? Words are words, but we need action, and so what we've been doing is working really closely with our students. And we have a lot of students that are really ready. They are ready to be active. They are ready to organize against racism. They are angry. They want change, and they want it now. And so we've been really trying to rally around our student voices and listen to them and start moving quickly. So our students and I have been sat down and worked on a resolution for our Board of Education to pass. We are calling it a resolution to eradicate racism that has some very bold statements, making sure we are very clearly stating that we believe Black Lives Matter, that we believe that racism is a health crisis and that we need to address it head on. And then with action steps of what we're going to take, we're going to create a better, I guess, we're going to revisit our equity policy to make sure it directly addresses racism in very clear ways, and ultimately keep leaning on our students. They have very big ideas. They want to change our entire curriculum, K-12, and I'm in. And so that's something that we're really listening to as well. Students are starting to understand that they've been fed a whitewashed history of this country, particularly when it comes to things like Brown versus Board of Education, and understanding the ramifications of what that actually did to the Black community, and the ways in which it has been taught that have been damaging. And so really trying to get a handle on all of that is where we're heading.
Excellent, Margaret. Thank you so much. Chris, what's George Mason doing?
I think the great thing about Mason is that we have always kind of prided ourselves on being bold and innovative, right? That's been kind of our mission statement for a long time. And the major thing is that racism isn't new. It's not new on college campuses. It's not new in this world. We've made statements before. So really, as Margaret, as James, as Yvette have all talked about, really it's about where is the action. And so one of the things that we first started off with is that we needed to talk to the community that had been most impacted, right? So it was around what was the self-care of our Black faculty, staff, and students. It was just like, and so it was reaching out to them, seeing how we, could really protect, take care of them, provide them what they needed. So after you take care of their self-care and their mental health, it was just like you move on to what are the action items. And we know what those are, right? We've had the focus groups, we've had the conversations, we've had all these notes for years, and what have we done with it? That was really the question. And so really there were two things. Are we going to respond to racism, or are we going to try to be anti-racist? That was really the question. And so we've been trying to say that we want to be anti-racist, and that requires us, again, to be bold and innovative. So that meant that we actually needed to go through and walk deliberatively through every aspect of our institution. And that means we have to look at, things from our research. Like, do we need to do things like, maybe we need to put in something like equity review boards for our research and not just IRBs. or we need to look at how our technology is like, and how we look at the way that we use data. Um, do we need to do things like remove the fear in our hiring practices? Do we need to maybe get rid of our implicit bias training and do something completely different, because we recognize that implicit bias training in faculty searches has been failing for years, right? We need to do something bold and different, because what we have been doing has been responding to racism and it has not been working. So that's what we have really been charged with doing. And so really it's been the action has been trying to do something deliberative. And so it's taken all the reflective practice that has already been done and actually trying to be very, very forward thinking, moving the needle forward and being transformative. So that's where we are now.
That is excellent. So let's take it up like a step lower. We've talked right now about what our institutions have done at this high level. But we are educators. That's what we do. So what can educators, K-12 and higher ed, do to combat racism and racial discrimination in the classroom? Boots on the ground. And let's start with you, Margaret.
I think this is the question, right? Because our students spend the majority of the time in classrooms, and we can do a lot from our levels, but if it's not changing the classroom, then it's not changing for kids. So I think one of the things that we've been talking about is just the idea of being able to talk freely and openly in classrooms about race and racism and the impacts, and supporting teachers to be able to have those conversations at early ages. There has been, I hear pushback in K-12 that some students are too young, and so educating our parents and our staff that no, they're not. My children, my husband is Black, my children are biracial, they're 4. They just turned 4 last week, and we are having conversations about race all the time. They are not too young, they understand, and we need to be talking to them. And so I think that in itself is huge. I also think that when we need to address the curriculum that we teach. So there is no neutral, right? There's no such thing as neutral math. And particularly, I know a lot of people here are engineers. How are we making math make sense for kids about things they care about? And right now, what they care about is justice. And so there's no reason that math can't be about justice. It should be. That is what students are passionate about. So all of their curriculum should be justice focused. And I think moving people away from this idea of I'm here to teach content. No, you're not. You're here to teach kids. You're here to teach kids content. And we need to teach kids what they want to be taught. And what they want to be taught is about justice.
That was an incredible response. Thank you, Margaret. James, what do you think from the university perspective? How are we going to fix this in the classroom? How are we going to help the educators learn how to fix this in the classroom?
Well, certainly, I think you have to do the self-reflections, which are critical. We talk about implicit bias, but there are some explicit biases that we don't ever talk about in the classroom, and how we define. And engineering is one of those spaces. Many, we don't say it, but it's in the air. Is if you don't come in with a certain level of pre-entry characteristics, you're not worthy to be in our institution. And it's conveyed it early and often in your educational journeys, and it fatigues you psychologically and emotionally. To be honest with you, being a K-12 person, is that I'm just frustrated with education, and I thought education was to educate people, but how our education works is based on class arrogance and intellectual snobbery. If you don't go to the right school, if you don't have the right parents, you don't live in the right neighborhoods, or if you're Black, oftentimes, you're not worthy to be in the engineering space. But we never talk about how we develop people. And to me, that's what education is about. If you know everything, why do we even go to college? I think we have to really revisit, and some people say I believe in diversity, but they fix on metrics that we know that don't predict educational outcomes. I know we can talk about these things, what happens with students, but we learn from adults what plays out in the household. And even my own children, insulated in the suburban world, highly educated family, is that I cannot protect them from how people see them. Too often, Black kids are seen as a part of a group rather than the individual, and they can't break away. And that mindset is that they're less than. And I know we say racism, but it was a great article that came out in the New York Times, and it talks about anti-Blackness. There is a strong view about anti-Blackness, and you can go all across the world and you see the same thing because I'm pretty well traveled. And you can go to Brazil, you can go to South Africa, you can go in Europe. That's why this movement is resonating, because people know when you say Blackness, it draws negative connotations to so many people, and it's creating a level of fatigue and psychological disconnectivity for so many of our students. Not only do they have to persevere, they have to go in an environment they don't even think that they can perform at the highest level. It's really important that we recognize that, just like this crisis, you can be, even me, not that I need someone to pat me on my back and say, are you okay? But we have people who don't even know how to communicate a degree of empathy and unconditional regard, knowing if you keep seeing these things over and over, it's going to have psychological and emotional consequences. First, I think every engineering school, every university, particularly predominantly white institutions, they really need to have an embedded therapist in their schools, because these Black students and other students of color are dealing with microaggressions and attacks against their sense of humanity on an ongoing basis. And it's not just the students, it's the faculty. We try to recruit students, but we really need to recruit faculty, because diverse faculty recruit diverse students. If you don't believe me, I learned when I was working at NSF, and no, people don't like to hear it, if you have a woman faculty member that's good, you're going to see a lot of women in the faculty. If you see someone for Iranian, you see a whole lot of Iranian faculty in it. And they create comfort. And so we have to really get at these things that prevent us from thinking about diversity, inclusion, and thinking about how it can advance all of us. And I think most of it is mindset, even if the data doesn't necessarily say that some of these metrics are not good predictors. People still want to use them, and I understand it. I'm at one of those institutions that like to think about U.S. News World Report and how we use those metrics. We only use it for 1 year, and all of us laugh at it. And my program is number one. And so anyway, I'm off my soapbox, but I think first and
let me take this back to the question that we were talking about, which is, what can educators do in the classroom? And I'm going to put a little twist on it for Yvette, because I'm going to say, right now, none of us are in the classroom. So what are we supposed to be doing with this virtual world that we're dealing with? How can educators combat racism in the class?
And I will pick up some of where James left off, and I think the first thing is getting the right people in the classroom to begin with. And that's one thing we've been looking at even before this all kind of came to the fore in the last few weeks. But we've been looking at how we recruit, how we evaluate candidates, not just to check some boxes and get more diverse numbers. We do want more diversity. But how can we evaluate candidates for their potential to contribute to an inclusive culture? And that's what carries over into the classroom. And I think that's what's needed to create climate change in engineering and education more broadly. So in particular, one of the first things that we started discussing when everybody had to shift to online learning was recognizing disparities in accessibility, both in terms of accessibility to resources, computing resources, internet access, and access for people with disabilities. And we know over and over from the literature that if you have a combination of marginalized identities, you're just kind of slammed a whole lot more than other people in the majority. So if you're a Black person with a disability or a person from a socioeconomically marginalized background with a disability or also Black, then your outcome is already you're already starting off behind, not because of you, but because of the way the system has failed. And so I think one key is to make sure that, again, we have the right people in place to begin with. And the other piece of that on the other side is having a way for departments, and this goes back to what we can do, have a way for departments and schools to hold people accountable along the lines of what they're doing to create an inclusive culture and to make sure that people have equitable opportunities to succeed. The way that hits faculty is it's got to be an evaluation process for promotion and tenure, and not in some way that just looks good and feels good, but some meaningful way with some teeth in it. And also with even staff, because our staff interact with students a whole lot. And so that student experience that James was describing is so much, it's shaped by what goes on outside of the classroom as much as it's shaped by what goes on inside of the classroom. And so it starts with being able to evaluate what people bring to the table in that regard, and being able to hold people accountable to it by whatever they're measured by for success on their job needs to include this in a very meaningful way. Another thing that Rice is doing, and this was just announced by the president, we are going to be establishing a course on diversity and cultural understandings that will be a part of a requirement for new students coming into Rice. And we're being very careful and intentional about how that's developed and bringing in the diverse stakeholders so that it's not, again, something that just checks a box, but it's something very practical, very applicable. And this is something, as Margaret was saying, these sorts of things with the social justice focus and how it applies to me and my future are things that students are looking for. And I'll take one more turn with it is ABET. ABET's engineering accreditation criteria, Engineering Accreditation Commission's criteria changed effective last fall. And throughout, there are very, very numerous opportunities to be able to teach more inclusively and to teach students to engineer more inclusively, which I think are very important. Oftentimes, I think people fail to just innovate in the curriculum in terms of how we can do things differently because they think, well, ABET doesn't allow fill in the blank. ABET is not prescriptive in that way. ABET sets criteria, and these criteria create a number of opportunities to be able to innovate. So one of the resources I'll share is an article that points to that.
That's excellent, Yvette. I'm going to take it up a level and go back to administrators at college level, university level, and let's maybe stick with the college level, colleges of engineering, colleges of computing. Chris, can you address what can be done at the college level to combat individual and systemic racism? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think Yvette definitely I think hit on the promotion tenure. It was like it has to be ingrained in the DNA. I think so often it's left to someone like a chief diversity officer. It's left as a strategic initiative. Go off and do this, but really, or it's left to faculty of color or women to kind of go in and do these initiatives, mentor, is like, students of color, mentor women, do this type of thing, as opposed to really what we should be doing is asking white male faculty who make up majority of engineering and computing faculty to be there and to kind of help us do this work. And, I think something that we've been trying within Volcano is the idea of an equity champion within our search committees. And the idea is that everyone should be an equity champion, but we're asking that each person is appointed as an equity champion. There's one person appointed as an equity champion, and that person, we're just asking them to hold their committee accountable. Is that you are going in and you're asking is like, did we review everybody? Are we holding everyone to the same criteria? Did we put confirmation bias on something? Did we use outside criteria? Did we put somebody on a pedestal that we weren't supposed to? Is like, did we go out and select, an institution and say, well, because we think that institution is top notch, we automatically selected that candidate? Did we go out and forget to count invisible labor? That's what we are trying to do, and to make sure that the people that we are counting and bringing in are getting a full accounting for what they're doing. That's one aspect, is that we're trying to implement something like that. Another thing is that you have to start talking around the aspects that most conversations are uncomfortable and most people don't want to have them. The reality is that I had faculty when I came in that did not know what the acronym HBCU meant. Right? It was like, that means that we have really got to have some really deep conversations around what diversity means within engineering and computing. We still have people within engineering and computing that, when we say diversity, will argue about what diversity in STEM looks like. So we have to be very explicit. NSF and the National Center for Statistics in Engineering and Sciences has been explicit around what that means. But we will kind of, edge around that sometimes. We have to be explicit. So I think as administrators, sometimes we have to have the uncomfortable conversations, and it requires that you have to have the support, not just of the deans. I think usually you may have a dean or associate deans on your side, but it requires that you have the support of department chairs as well. I think oftentimes that's where we don't go for the additional support. You have to have the department chairs all on board as well, because that's the missing part, that's the missing connection to the faculty that ends up being so crucial for buy-in. Everybody has to be at the table in order for us to move the needle forward.
That's very true. It is a matter of accountability, and often the accountability is lacking. And if there is no accountability, then people will not do what they're supposed to be doing. I mean, we all know that. Let me move into the engineering education piece, from the standpoint that we are educating engineers, and we recognize that there are how can I say that? Challenges. I'll say this. There are challenges both inside the classroom and in the institution where engineering and computing is often contributing to the systemic racism. Okay. And for example, we've got the Flint water crisis that occurred. Okay. That disproportionately affected people in low socioeconomic areas and predominantly Black people. We have machine learning systems that are so faulty that they routinely identify Black people as not a person, but as an animal or as a criminal or as something else. So how can we, and I'm actually paraphrasing another question that one of our listeners ask, how can we bring a greater understanding of diversity into the curriculum? How can we change the engineering curriculum that has these built-in biases and these historical biases?
I think if we want to be equity-minded, anti-racist, we need to have a committee that, like we have an accreditation board. We shouldn't wait for the accreditation board to evaluate. We should have an internal committee that evaluates our curricula and our hiring practices and to make sure that they align. I think that's very important. But I also, to what's basic and fundamental as a good starting point is making sure you hire in the workforce that exhibit the characteristics that we want to showcase in our college. For example, we have colleges that say they value diversity and inclusion, but when you look at the job description, there's nothing that exhibit that diversity, inclusion, or broadening participation is a value. It's a part of our ethos. So I think that is very important in the work that we do.
I'm not sure anybody heard that. I heard a phone. Yvette, would you like to weigh in on this? Can you address this issue?
Yes. And again, James always gives me these great segues, so thank you. In the School of Engineering, one thing we have done is become more intentional. And again, this predates the current events, but become more intentional in our job announcements to make sure that they convey not just the little EEOC blurb at the bottom that says we want everybody to apply, but we convey throughout the description of the institution of the School of Engineering, and we added also in the job requirements themselves to be able to convey that we are looking for people who are going to commit to helping to create and maintain a culture of inclusion. So we want people who can mentor and advise diverse students, and so we have a number of these things that are in our faculty, staff, and postdoc job announcements. Another thing on the educating engineers side of things is that when you look at most engineering societies' codes of ethics, American Institute for Chemical Engineers, IEEE, National Society of Professional Engineers, ACM for computing, and ASCE. In all of those codes of ethics, and this is growing in number because I've had conversations with folks at ASME as well, but in all of those societies' codes of ethics, there are principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, they're there to varying extents. So some may be as basic as treat everyone fairly and, we don't tolerate discrimination and harassment. Others are very much more explicit in the expectations. So for instance, AICHE said that chemical engineers should contribute to an inclusive work environment and recognize the value of differences that people bring to the table. American Society of Civil Engineers in Canon 8, we state that we not only treat everybody with dignity, respect, and fairness, but we create opportunities for equitable engagement. We don't participate in discrimination and harassment, and we consider the diversity of the communities we serve and endeavor to include diverse perspectives in the planning and performance of our work. ACM, throughout their entire code of professional conduct, it's all people-focused and recognizing first and foremost that people are the stakeholders that computing should be concerned about. And so I bring that up because when we're talking about educating engineers, we need to make sure this is how we're teaching ethics. So all of the codes say we hold paramount public safety, health, and welfare. But I think what's overlooked a lot of times is a big part of that public welfare has to do with just what we're talking about today. And that is equity and inclusion, whether it's with communities we're doing research in, or for civil engineers research, work that you're doing to design infrastructure for communities. we have to be inclusive in the way that we do that. And we have to really flip the script on the way we've been teaching, and we can do that from a platform of ethics, because it's the right thing to do, and increasingly is becoming an expectation of professional practice.
True. That's very true. Let me ask a different question here. And actually, I'm taking this from, again, our audience. I think it's a really good question. All of us right now are dealing with budget issues caused by COVID, budget issues caused by low enrollment. You know, a lot of us are recognizing that the international students brought a lot of money to our institutions, and they are not there, they're not present. So the question is, we're kind of stuck with what we got, okay? We're stuck with our current colleagues. So the question is, how do we educate our fellow teachers? And I'm going to ask you, Margaret, how do we educate them about what racism is and how it impacts how they act and how their students relate to them?
That's a great question. We have some training we call Dismantling Racism, where we break a lot of that down for our teachers. But I think, and James said it well earlier, they got to start taking a deep dive inside, and we gotta help them do that. But teachers cannot educate their Black students if they don't see their Black students as brilliant. And so that's about them starting to internalize, or looking inside and saying, like, what are the beliefs that I have, and how do I start to break apart those beliefs and create new ones, right? How, you know, we all know, right, that racism is kind of this smog that we're all inhaling, and if we're not paying attention to it, particularly us as white people, right? You know, I was ignorant about racism for a large part of my life, and so white people specifically need to take that really hard look inside and ask themselves that question: do I see my Black children as brilliant? And if you don't, then you shouldn't be in front of them. And so how, I think, like, really pushing people and holding them accountable, right? If we're not holding accountable our teachers that are posting social media that is not aligned with our beliefs, like, they need to be held accountable. And I think, you know, that kind of starts at the top, and the Board of Education in K-12, Board of Education superintendent making a statement: this is who we are. We are an anti-racist institution. This is my expectation of you, and I'm going to hold you to that expectation. But it takes internal work, and I can't teach you about racism if you're not willing to hear it. And so I think a lot of it has to do with hiring and accountability ultimately, but it's really, as I said, people looking inside of themselves.
That's very true. I think one of the issues, and I think an issue, let me put it that way, an issue is the concept of white privilege is really difficult for white people. And it's a very uncomfortable feeling. And so it's almost like when we try to discuss racism and issues about race, you have to kind of step around it so that people don't feel guilty about the fact that it exists. Because if you can't get past that guilt, you can't get to the "let me teach you something" part. And so that can be very, very difficult. Let me ask this question. How can we work to dismantle an educational system that was not built for diversity? It was not created for diversity. For a long time, you know, we had separate but equal, so there was a whole separate educational path for Black students. And we are now in this educational path that was created by white people for their needs. And we have inserted other races into this system. So who would like to address how we can really disrupt and dismantle what we have and rebuild it into what we need?
So, I mean, if we're going to I don't know if we're I don't know if we can I don't know if we're going to dismantle, disrupt, disfund, but at minimum we have to stop operating as if it's fair. It's like I'll start there. I think one of the things that I think bothers me is that we will rage as a society, as a nation, we'll rage and we'll take a case all the way to the Supreme Court when it comes to African Americans getting a fair shot at education through things like affirmative action with cases like Abigail Fisher. Yet when, say, white celebrities like Felicity Huffman and Lori Loughlin not only game the system, but ultimately they and their children receive no real punishment, we're okay with that. We let that go. And what that does is that continues to set a precedent that this is okay, right? It was like you can buy your way in, you can maneuver around, and we'll turn the other way, we'll slap your wrist. But if you work hard and get in, even through policy legislation, then we will fight you if you are black. And it's this idea of righting historical wrongs is, it's such a problem. And that's how the racism continues to thrive. It's this fear of bucking the status quo. And we have to get rid of that. We have to, I don't know if it's that we've got to set up a unemptying pot of funds that will support an institution to fight the battles, or whether it's that we've got to have presidents and legal councils that are agreed to be transformational leaders and are saying we will take on all the lawsuits. But the time for treading water is over. It's sink or swim time. It was like we've got to fight that. We've got to take the battles on at this point. There's no other way for us to do it. We've got to take the battles on.
James, your thoughts on that?
Well, my background K-12, and I think that's a starting point. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that even when the institutions can be all black, they still may uphold white supremacy and some of the same systems that we're trying to break. We need a system that adapt to people, adapt to kids, rather than expecting kids to adapt to the system. We need for all our kids to perform optimal. And we should create systems in which they can do that. I don't think we have systems that can do that. And not only that, we have to right the wrongs on how we fund educational systems. Let's face it, a disproportion of black and brown and low income, they live in rural and urban contexts. And then we create this mythology that everything is about merit. And when we know it will then start, your zip code plays a critical role in whether or not you can matriculate at my alma mater, Virginia Tech, or you go to Ohio State, where I currently work. We know that all of those things play a critical role. But I do know in America, it's easy for us to talk about income, but we know that the gaps are that blackness still matter because the achievement gap is greater for the $100,000 a year black family and the $100,000 a year white family. The gaps are not as wide for on the low income area because you can camouflage your identity when you white, and whiteness is still most salient in our society, and it's affirmed in all parts of the world, and you can see it in how people are rewarded for it. So I think we need an educational system that we reevaluate and we develop new models. But not only that, we have to get a new workforce of educators that work in these systems that ensure that our students are given a quality education. To me, this is national security issues, and I'm glad that you brought up, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about it. Somewhat, this forces universities to focus on the things, not that we shouldn't have international students, But in 1983, the Hudson Institute produced a workforce development report and said the new worker would be women, ethnic minorities, and immigrants. September 11th, and here we are with immigrants or international students. We're at this crossroads again. Our public policy is challenging. In some universities, they're going to be in the red for a long time if we don't get the visa things right. But we have to invest in those communities that are traditionally not invested. If we want to maintain our global edge, we have to invest in historically underrepresented population. It is an economic imperative, even if you don't want to focus on social justice. If you want our country to continue to progress, we must, but I think it's a moral imperative, but some people, they respond around economics. And so I think we should all be committed. One thing I love about engineers that I'm not an engineer, but I spend enough time with them that at least I can somewhat think like them, is that if I told them that they needed to solve a water problem, almost everybody online would figure out how to solve that water problem. Well, here's one of our great problems. It's a global problem. And if we can solve this problem, we can solve a lot of the pandemics that we're enduring. It takes that kind of level of tenacity and courage to create the kind of communities that we want to live in. And hopefully I'll get to see it because my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and my grandparents didn't see the community, but they're certainly proud of me because I am the beneficiary of some of their hard work and labors, but they were really the most deserving, not me. And so I think we all, if we want to make America great again, that we always talking about, this must be an imperative for our nation.
Thank you, James. I want to give a quick answer to a question that was asked here. How do we, the question went away. How do we hold students accountable for their words and actions like in a team project when there is no unequivocal evidence of the behavior? And the reason I want to address that question is because I actually got that from a faculty co-worker of mine. And my very simple solution was, because apparently the men were making comments that were fairly sexist. And I basically said, tell the young ladies to record the entire meeting on their phone. Nobody has to know. Just record it on your phone. And when they say something, then you have the record and you can take it to someone and have it addressed. We are almost out of time. I'm seeing this. I want to give each of the panelists a quick minute to just whatever is on your mind, your last thoughts on this topic of racism in our educational system. I'll start with Margaret.
The one thing that's just kind of hanging in my head right now that I want to say is that in education, I think so often we look for like fixes or quick things that we can do, and we're talking about very complex issues that are going to require a lot of different solutions, but none of them require fixing our kids. Our kids are perfect. They are brilliant as they are. They require fixing our systems. And so we need to make sure we're not putting in anything in place that talks about trying to fix our kids because they are perfect as they are.
Margaret, so well said. Thank you. Yvette, your last thought.
I feel like I'm in church. I was about to say amen. I love it. One thing I want to just emphasize, and again, James set it up beautifully, is that we need to approach equity in engineering education the way that we do any other engineering problem. And that's one of the premises my podcast is built on, is that we need to approach this. It's not a one-time hit it. It's not I put a statement out, or it's not I did this one thing. It's going to be a very user-centered, iterative design process. So it has to be very intentional, and it has to involve the diverse stakeholders that are part of the engineering education ecosystem, as well as some very creative, innovative thinking. We typically think of innovation in terms of our technical areas. This is going to require some innovation in a whole different way that a lot of us are not comfortable doing. But when you think about being uncomfortable, please think about people like me and like Chris and like James and whomever else who have been very uncomfortable in a lot of situations where we've been systemically
Very well
excluded.
said. James, quickly, last thoughts.
I would just say thank you for everyone who logged in. I don't want you to walk away from this webinar and feel helpless. You have the power. You can be the tipping point. You're the person that we've been waiting for to change the reality for so many of our beloved Americans. Thank you for what you have done, and thank you in advance what you will be doing.
Thank you, James. Chris?
Engineering is like, as a system has long been used to either disenfranchise or build up systems, right? And that's either been used to marginalize communities. It can also be used to empower and build community. And so I think that that's the great thing is engineering educators is like, that's the power that's here. It's one of the reasons why I chose to come and spend my time working in diversity, equity, and inclusion in engineering education. It's where I believe the future of this work goes. So it's why I'm here as a resource, and again, here to help. Thankful to be here. Thankful for you all.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm going to use these last minutes to address something that was said, one of the questions, the comments that was made about the fact that this panel has focused on African Americans and Black people. That is the national debate right now. I know all of us recognize that non-whites are discriminated against. That means Hispanic and immigrants, people from other countries. I don't pretend to know what it is like to be a Hispanic person, because I'm not. I am African American. That's my entire heritage. That's all I've ever been. We have a unique place in this country's history that is different from any other person of color. And we need to recognize that. Not that we're better or worse or more discriminated against or less discriminated against. It is what it is. And I would agree that perhaps the next panel might discuss the Hispanic presence in the United States and how they have been treated. And maybe another panel on the Asian American presence in the United States and how they have been treated. But I am not apologizing for the fact that this panel focused on the African American experience. I think it was a long time coming. I apologize, we went about a minute over. I want to thank everybody that on the panel. You guys have been wonderful. I want to thank everybody that has been listening to us. I hope that we were able to shed some light and give some help. I know there's a ton of resources that have been posted by the presenters and by other people. So take advantage of that. And I leave you with this. It is a difficult conversation. What isn't? You can do this. We can do this. And if we don't, who will? Do we want this world to be the world that our children inherit? I don't think so. Have a nice day, everybody.